Mind-body medicine is grounded in the understanding that everything that happens to us in our lives affects both our mind and body. Everything that happens emotionally, every thought we have, affects every function in our body, and vice versa. There's a continual biochemical, physiological conversation that's going on among all parts of ourselves. And mind-body medicine is the way we enter into that conversation, and we are able to make changes that bring us back into balance and then enhance our functioning. What happens when we are under extreme stress of any kind is that it disrupts all the functions in our body. So it affects the way our nervous system works, it affects our digestive system. We're putting out high levels of stress hormones, which in turn decrease functioning in certain areas of the brain that are concerned with awareness and judgment and compassion, and increase functioning in areas concerned with fear and anger, sort of more primitive areas of the brain. So under stress, we get thrown out of balance. We move into what's called the fight or flight response, which is a natural response when we're having to deal with danger, either to fight and hopefully win the fight or run away. Now that's fine, that's there in all vertebrates. The problem is that in we humans, the fight or flight response continues long after it's necessary. So we stay in that state of hyperarousal and agitation and anxiety and difficulty sleeping and focusing for weeks, months, years. The other thing that happens is if the stress or trauma is overwhelming, for example, what happened in the kids at Marjory Stoneman Douglas. And the trauma is both overwhelming and inescapable. Somebody's come with a gun, it's terrifying, life is threatened, and you can't go anywhere. Then sometimes, in addition to fight or flight, people, adults as well as children, go into a freeze response. The body kind of shuts down and we become detached and body becomes stiff and we feel disconnected from everybody. So that's the consequence of really difficult situations, is that we often have continuing fight or flight and a continuing freeze response, and it affects every aspect of our lives. I got interested in this work because I think initially it was probably, I was interested in what's going on with other people. And I had an idea from the time I was a pretty young kid that I wanted to do something useful with my life. And my father was a doctor, so being a doctor was a kind of natural way to do something useful. And I was also really interested in people's stories. And I was the kind of kid I grew up in New York City. I'd be on the subway, some homeless guy would tap me on the shoulder and say, "Hey kid, you want to hear the secret of the universe?" I said, yes, sure. So I was always interested in the stories, I was always interested in how lives unfold, and I wanted to be helpful. So psychiatry was a way of bringing together listening to people's stories and being helpful to them. As time went on, I became particularly interested as I went through my own hard times as a 20 years old, and I was having, confusion about being in medical school and having difficulties with my girlfriend, and I finally decided I needed help. And so I went to see a psychiatrist who did therapy with me, and I began to discover things about myself and ways to understand myself and help myself that were both very new to me and also very exciting. I was going through a terrible time. I was really significantly depressed, but I began to see that I could come through it. And so what I saw was that my connection to this other person was crucially important, and the things I was learning about myself and the way I was able to use, I didn't know anything about mind-body medicine, wasn't even a word in 1963. It was just, it hadn't yet come into existence. But for example, I discovered if I went for a long walk, I felt better. And so that became part of my healing. Or if I took some time in nature, I felt better. Or if I hung out with other people instead of withdrawing, the way I tended to do when I was really depressed, didn't ordinarily do that, that could help. So I began to see that I could better understand myself and I could help myself. And over the years in working with psychiatric patients, I began to bring this understanding to them. And then when I was a researcher at the National Institute of Mental Health in the early 1970s, I started looking at all these other ways that people had of understanding and helping themselves, like meditation and mental imagery and yoga and Tai Chi. And I was starting to do those things, and I was reading the scientific literature and the research literature that showed that these approaches changed the way the brain worked. They changed the way people felt. They didn't cost anything. They didn't have any negative side effects. So I began to think this needs to be part of what we do in medicine and healthcare and psychiatry and psychology. So that's how I began to develop this approach. I think it's really important, this is a point I always make, is that trauma is universal. It's going to affect all of us sooner or later. If it doesn't affect us when we're young, as we get old, we're not as strong, we develop illnesses, we lose people we love, we face our own death. Trauma is a part of life. I've just finished a book, which is coming out soon, called The Transformation, Discovering Wholeness and Healing After Trauma. This is a universal experience, trauma, and a universal possibility. So that needs to be conveyed to everyone. You mentioned first responders, and of course they're dealing with overwhelming trauma almost every day. And the culture, unfortunately, until recently, and even now, has been, no, you gotta suck it up, you gotta go ahead, don't pay attention to that, you're tough, you can, but nobody is that tough. And now firefighters and police have some of the highest levels, not only of suicide, but also of chronic illness and depression. So we've got to make this understanding universal, and make it universal in the people who are leaders in the community, or leaders, the police chiefs and the fire chiefs, so that they don't say, oh, suck it up, go back in there, or what's the matter with you? You'll go see a shrink, get some pills. It's not like that. It's much more like, yeah, we've all gone through that. One of my very interesting early experiences in working with population-wide psychological trauma was during the war in Kosovo. There were peacekeepers from all over the world there, and the commanding general was a French-Canadian, Michel Maisonneuve, and I gave a talk, like the talk I gave here in Broward County. He came up to me afterward, he said, I've got post-traumatic stress. He said, I get it, and I'm really so glad you're here, and I want to make sure that all the men and women who are under my command have the opportunity to learn these techniques and learn these skills. So leadership, there it was military leadership in the community needs to understand that. And what's crucial is that the response should not primarily be a medical response. You got a problem, you go see the shrink. It should be a public health response, that everybody is going through difficult times, particularly after an event like the shootings of last February 14th. Everybody is affected, and everybody needs to heal, and everybody needs to both learn to use the tools for healing and also come together. Some people may also need to see people, individual therapists, psychologists, psychotherapists, that's fine, but the whole community needs to be understood as having been traumatized and in need of healing. The work we're doing is moving forward through the kinds of training programs that we're doing. Here, it's primarily with adults. We have 10 students from Marjory Stoneman Douglas who are part of this training program, but the other 140 people are teachers, therapists, counselors, parents who are actively involved in the community. We need to train a critical mass of people in this work of self-awareness, self-care, and group support, and to support them as they work with all members in all parts of Broward County. And this has to be a long-term commitment. This is not a quick fix. This is about training. 180 people came last year to the training, 140 this year, 300, probably more like 2,000 or 3,000 people should over the years be trained who can share this work in different ways. But there's got to be a commitment, an ongoing commitment to serving the whole community. Without that, the trauma is going to persist. What we need to be created is a culture of healing and a culture of wellness as opposed to a culture, it's not even a culture, as opposed to a reaction of avoidance or a reaction of blame. Those are not going to help, either one. It's a question of people coming together, and our work is to just help people learn these basic tools and to support them as they share it with others. And so what the teachers are doing in the schools, what the counselors are doing with the kids and the family members, and what the kids are doing with each other. We're training peer counselors. That's beautiful. We started at MSD, but I would love that to be in all schools that have peer counseling programs so they can learn these basic skills and share it with the other kids. This work should be throughout the county. And you know, the interesting thing is that it needs to be offered to people. I think that the more communication there is to people, inviting them to participate. The work that we do translates very easily across cultures. We have worked in many sort of low-income communities where there's a great deal of violence. I'm thinking Cité Soleil in Haiti, maybe the most violent community in the world. And people welcome this, they get it. This is nothing to do, this is not an upper middle class white thing. We're drawing on all the world's healing traditions. And my experience working here in the US, working in the Caribbean, working in Europe and the Middle East and Africa, people understand it, that the challenge, and really the challenge for the community, is to reach out and bring in those people who are ordinarily neglected or underserved, and to make the kinds of things that we have and perhaps others have available to them. They will embrace it if they're encouraged and they're given the opportunity.